Hello and welcome to the Post Peak podcast. I'm James and this is Jack, and we're here to present you a brand new podcast about cars and why we think we're in a state that's post peak car.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format and what to expect as you come on the journey with us. We're hoping to bring on some guests, some point of view, people that work in the industry, get their perspective on what post peak means to them, asking about different topics around their car experience, their favorite car, what their key aspirations from a car perspective is. Topics like reliability, financing, funding, and just general car over ownership as well. So, James, from your point of view, what is post peak?
I think there are so many aspects that make up why we're potentially in a world for petrol heads that we've hit the peak, we've gone past the best of cars, and really the best way to enjoy cars going forward is to actually look backwards, which sounds a really weird phrase, but it's genuinely what I believe. I think if you talk about people that are petrol heads and they enjoy driving, whether that's a sports car or whether it's a day-to-day car, so many of the things that we love about driving as petrol heads has slowly been eroded over the years. And some would say that that would maybe start with the introduction of almost every car being turbocharged. Lots of people like non-turbocharged and naturally aspirated cars, and I think we started seeing that probably around like 2015, 2016. I always use a benchmark of what was BMW doing at the time, and they brought out their M3 in 2014, I think, and that was the first turbocharged BMW M3 after the mighty E90 V8. Um, but then for me, on a sports car perspective, really the start of the end was more so the introduction of petrol particulate filters, and that was, I think, middle of 2018 production after July August 2018, something like that. After that, um, it kind of it kind of fell out for me, and I don't think I've actually owned a performance car since after that date. I've never had one. My last cars have been 2018, then I bought a 2017 car, then 2016, and now I've got a 2015. So I'm clearly going backwards to go forward.
I was going to say we're going in the wrong direction, aren't we?
We are.
Definitely,
We
see,
are.
definitely doesn't seem progress, does it? It seems like we're going back in time, not forward in time, given the things that we're being forced to do.
Yeah. I mean, what's your thoughts? What's your thoughts on sports cars specifically?
I think there's a level of emotion and experience and character that's kind of missing from a lot of new cars that I drive these days. I do a lot of driving for work, so I'm in normally a relatively new car every time I take a kind of a journey in a to see a client or a customer. And there's a lot of screens, there's a lot of lane assist, there's just a hell of a lot of stuff that does a lot of thinking for you. And I don't think in the last few years any modern car, maybe post 2000, 2000, sorry, 20, I've got into that I've been waiting to get back into again. I've done the journey, I've done the trip, handed back in the keys, whatever it is, and I've not craved to jump straight back in that car and take it on another drive again. Whereas, like you, I've owned cars, and actually the cars that I'm more interested in purchasing as a next step will be in that sort of 2010 to maybe 2015 era, where you've still got a level of reliability, I think, which is important, especially if you're going to use it from a day to day perspective. But you've still got that emotion and that character and that drawback and that analog, that emotion that when you get in that car and you take it down a B road or an A road on a Sunday morning. But equally, if you need to go and see someone, or it's a multi-purpose thing, it won't let you down every time you drive it, and you don't have to spend a huge amount of money maintaining it and storing it away. It's a lot more of that usable factor in it. So I think finding that balance where you've not got necessarily a collectible car you're going to store and not use and be too scared to use, but equally something that is a bit more of a multi-purpose, perhaps future classic.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, it's quite. I find it quite exciting because at the ages that we're at, probably let's say mid 30s ish, um, we're able to choose from a hell of a lot of great cars that are still in that window of being at least semi reliable, particularly ones that have been kind of looked after from the start. They haven't been thrashed, they've had the right ownership, etc. You can end up in what many people will feel is peak car, and you've got such a wide choice. And then it's interesting about the ones which are doing well in the market because of that versus potentially some underappreciated ones. And I think as we go through episodes in this podcast, we'll try and uncover some of those, like why they're really strong, and sometimes where the value reflects that, and sometimes where it doesn't. I think
Have
interestingly
you
though, where you say post 2020 cars, not ones that aren't as interesting, it's I think there probably are still interesting cars at that level. Like if you think about a 992 GT3, for example, or if you love track work, a 992 GT3 RS, like from a performance perspective, it probably hasn't got any better. And those cars are definitely unobtainable to me. But I'd still very much be interested in getting into something like that if I could, because at least they're still naturally aspirated. You can still get manual ones. Yes, the exhausts have been massively quieter than they used to be, but you can still do bits and bobs around that from a aftermarket perspective. But you have to deal with things like every time you get in the car, you have to turn off the lane assist and you have to turn off these EU regulated features, which again take away from the joy of driving for me. So, what would you pick a would you pick a 992 GT3 because it's the latest and greatest, or would you go for like a 991.2 GT3 instead? And I think
I
that's
was
the
gonna
crux of the argument.
there's a couple of good question. I think for me it's the cost of these new cars. You know, in a way, a little bit justifiable in my reach anyway at the moment. I mean, what's the price of a new 992 GT3, for example? Not even an RS, just a GT3 without many spec. You're looking at what, £250,000 car, unless you know
Possibly
someone
not
at
that
Porsche.
high. I saw one recently advertised a 992.2 GTS with some spec on it, and it was like 185 grand. But the GT3 has always been quite good value. But yeah, you're
So here's
talking the upper end of the hundreds for anyone with any kind of spec in it, I think, pushing on
so
200
let's
probably.
let's take that. Let's take 100K, because that's a very big budget for most people, right? You think 100K, you could have one very modern, very pretty much, out the showroom, brand new car for a healthy budget of 100K. Or would you have potentially two or three, maybe, which is kind of where you are right now, right? Your journey is that, you've got three different
Yeah,
vehicles for three
I have
different
three cars.
purposes in some respects, right? And
Yeah,
and
I have
that
three cars that are probably, if I add them all up at roughly market value, it's under 100, just about. Yeah.
and each one of them serves a slightly different purpose, right? But doesn't that give you a little bit more of a sense of occasion? Because each one you're going to look forward to a slightly different experience, or you're going to use each tool, I guess, slightly differently for a slightly different purpose. So, yeah, I mean, I had a similar journey to you when I bought a 991.2 Carrera T, and probably the best car I've ever owned, and I actually probably one of the cars that got away. When you think about car ownership, you're like, why did I sell that? That was by far the best car, and a car that I regret selling, actually, and maybe a car that I might buy back at some point when the time's right. But I look at that and I ended up keeping that very nice, because I always felt that I was looking after that for someone else. I never really truly felt like I really deserved that car in a way. So I ended up buying two other cars, family car, and then a car that I could kind of knock around in and drive to the station and drive to the shops in. So I didn't, so when I jumped in the 911, it was an occasion, it was a special thing. The downside to which, though, was that I barely put any miles on it, and I'm not proud of that. Being a petrol head, having a low mileage 911 or any type of sports car, to be honest, I don't think is something that I'd be proud of. And that was probably the reason why I passed it on, because I just wasn't using it, sadly. So,
Mm.
what's your experience been like having the three versus perhaps selling all three and buying one that could be unreal, but may have other challenges.
Well, I need at least two from a family perspective. I think you and I are both family men, and the realities of having kids is that you're busy on the weekend ferrying people around, and having one car is pretty tricky. But as you say, if it were to be something like that, it'd probably be like an RS6, right? Because it's a large family estate car that's also fast and also fun. But is it fun enough to say I want to take this out on a lovely Sunday morning and have a little bit of escapism in the summer from 6 a.m. till 9 a.m., which is typically what I like to try and do in the summer if I can. Um, Probably not. The lineup that I have at the moment is I've recently got a 991.1 GTS, Carrera GTS, the last of the naturally aspirated Carreras. Um, and I have a M340D Touring, which is a absolutely awesome car. I've owned that since new in 2022. It might well be the last internal combustion engine car I ever buy. Certainly new from a new perspective. And because we're coming into winter, I decided to take my 911 off the road this winter, and therefore set about finding a cheap winter runaround, and settled on something different I've never tried before. I've got a Jaguar XF 2009 XFS diesel, 3 litre diesel, which I picked up for the bargain price of about 4.5 grand. Um, and I'm really enjoying knocking around in that at the moment. It's not the most dynamic car in the world, but it serves the needs of what I need in a winter car really well. I might say differently if snow falls and I'm in a heavy rear wheel drive car and I should have bought a Range Rover. Um, but yeah, that's the lineup that I have at the moment, and all three of those cars serve a slightly different purpose.
Yeah, and I think actually, in some ways, it touches some of the markets that I'm keen to discuss throughout the series of these podcasts. Right? It's kind of what can you buy at, say, if you had a £5,000 to £10,000 budget, what's a great buy right now? What could serve a purpose in that segment? Maybe the 20 to 30k bracket, and then maybe the sort of 50 to 70k bracket. And I think you've kind of got something somewhere in between all of those, which is quite interesting, for a different reason, I guess. And I had the similar predicament with the 911 that and it might just be a Porsche thing, just because we care about our cars, right? But I ended up
Mhm.
buying a £2,000 Discovery 3 on eBay, which was a complete punt. That was like literally like going onto a roulette table and going, yeah, all on red. And you're going to get a good one or you're going to get a bad one. I think you're definitely a betting man buying a Land Rover of that age. It was a
And was it a
2000
good
and
one?
it was a good one. I was very lucky, and I kind of went in a bit blind as well. I'd read a lot about them. I did a lot of research on them, but I think what I wanted, I wanted a 2005. So this is one of the cheapest cars I bought in the last, say, 10 years, but it actually was probably one of the best cars I've ever bought. And again, I've sold that, and I'm gutted I sold that. So don't let me get too close to cars, because I think I pass them on too quickly without really thinking about the longer term plan. But it was a 2005, so it was an early Discovery 3. It was a 2.7 diesel. It was a manual box, so it had the low tax. It was a cloth interior. It was base spec, no sunroof, so no leaky wet seats in the morning. But it
Mm.
was still probably the car I've had the least amount of anxiety driving in the last 10 years, because typically I would go into a car park in any other car that I'd own. I'd go and park at the furthest space away from everyone else, because I was so paranoid that someone would scratch the side of my car or open their door into the side of it. So I was always quite paranoid where I parked cars, even some of the cars I've got today. And so that car I would happily go into train station car park, find the closest space to
The
the station.
closest one to the door,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then what you'd find is, because I'd never really washed it very often either, I'm a bit unlike you in the sense that I probably didn't care too much about the exterior of the car anyway.
Yeah.
Probably washed it every 3 to 4 months, so no one would park next to it, because it was this grotty, mud covered Discovery 3. And anyway, so I took it for its first service with a good friend of mine that does a lot of work on all the cars that I own. And he looked underneath it and he said, "Look, if you ever sell that, I'll buy it off you because this is actually it's got no rust. They're quite rare to find one that has got very little rust underneath." There was a few things that needed to be changed. We had a wheel bearing, typical brake pads, all that sort of stuff, general wear and tear. But overall, it was a really sound example. I think I was just worried that eventually something would give, and yeah, there would be a very big bill with it. And I think that was the level of anxiety that I've had owning at least three Land Rovers in the last sort of 4 years. Is that
Mm.
no matter what price point you pay for them, you've always got this level of anxiety. It's going to leave you at the side of the road at some point. So I think you made a good choice with the Jag over the
I mean, it
over
hasn't broken down in the first 6 weeks that I've had it, so that, that's I've got a wooden table here and I'm touching it a lot. But yeah, I think the interesting thing for me is I haven't had a car that cheap for a little while. Probably the last one was I had an E91 325D touring a couple of years back, which was seven or 8 grand, something like that. But again, that car was like I really loved it. I'd owned it for a long time. I'd spent quite a bit of money on it, and therefore I'd got precious about it. Whereas with the Jag, similar to your experience, I it's just a different ownership experience where you're not really that worried about it, but it's you still enjoy it.
Mm,
And there's definitely something to be said for that. But I think that's where there's something to be said for as much as other halves might not always like it. Um, Having as many cars as you can because then you always have a right car for the right usage and the right occasion, the right day, the right distance. Um, so yeah,
I
I'm
can
really enjoying having 3 cars at the moment.
I completely agree. I think there's definitely a segment. I just think given where a lot of people are in their lives, and the fact that we're quite time poor as dads and we've got busy careers, the last thing you need is a huge amount of anxiety owning any level of vehicle, whether it's something that you bought off eBay for a couple of grand or whether you've gone out and bought a 911. The last thing you want is that ownership. You want it to be a positive experience from the get go. You don't want to be sitting there thinking there's going to be a very large bill coming, and I didn't account for that for whatever reason. And
And
I
it's
guess
also
there's always
the time,
it's
right?
the
Going
time,
back
yeah,
and forth to the garage, getting someone to give you a lift, like breaking down at the side of the road, having to spend 3 hours trying to find parts, you know,
yeah.
all time that is scarce.
So if we look at we can talk about best cars, and I think it's probably quite clear what your favourite car you've owned, but it'd be good to talk about it. But I think the worst car. Let's talk about the worst first. Get the worst out of the way first. But the worst car I ever owned was when we were desperately trying to buy our own property, and it was our first house, and I was desperately trying not to borrow any money, and didn't really have a penny to my name. And I remember thinking, I've got to save really hard, and so I off of a Mercedes mechanic of mine at the time, a guy I used to know quite well. I actually bought a what was it, a CLK 320s. It was the 3.2 litre V6 convertible, so it was a cabriolet.
Okay.
But the problem was, it'd done 150,000 miles. So whatever that, the engines in those, it was a 1999. So when we talk about the era, it was on the cusp of potentially post peak,
Yeah, so we're talking like
maybe
T Reg, something like
T-Reg.
that.
It was a T-Reg. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it was a convertible. I think I paid just over £1,000 for it in the end, off of a friend of mine that just MOT'd it and serviced it. And I just used it as a runaround for about 18 months while I was trying to move into our first house because I was desperately not trying to borrow any money. And I think from a reliability standpoint, that was probably the best and probably the strongest. So when we talk about post peak, I would say from a Mercedes standpoint, the engine would have been the last thing to go. The whole car would have collapsed around the engine, and that engine would have kept going. And you go to places like Egypt or these kind of resorts in Tenerife, and they still drive 30-year-old Mercedes as taxis, and they've got
Yeah, because they
half a
don't have any
million miles.
rust.
Yeah, and they've got half a million miles on the clock, and they're still going strong. So, what did used to happen though is my boss would never get in it with me because the rear footwells, when it rained, would fill up with water. So there was clearly a leak in the roof.
Yeah.
So it would condensate. So we ended up creating like a greenhouse inside this car. So you had constantly steamed up windows, which was quite interesting. And it used to just smell of mold. But for the time that I had it, and actually ended up failing its MOT because of rust. To your point, ended up selling it
Yeah.
on eBay as spares and repairs, and a guy picked it up for 800 quid. So for an 18-month depreciation, £200 or there or thereabouts, given some running costs, wasn't a huge amount. It's probably the lowest amount of money I've ever lost on any car. So that's probably my absolute worst. But saying that, wasn't a complete disaster.
Yeah.
What about you?
My worst was probably just after I bought my first house, and we moved from having a nice little cheap 2003 reliable Ford Fiesta that was that one where the B pillar trims all fell off on them. So we'd lost the B pillar trims on ours as well. But that car was fine. It did the job, but it was completely boring. We're like, oh, we've got our house now, we've got married, let's go and get ourselves a nice fun car. And we bought a 2010 Mini Cooper S, which I think was the one with the Renault engine or Peugeot engine. It's one of the two.
Yeah.
And
Is
that
it the
car,
RCZ, the RCZ engines? They put those in those as well, haven't they? The Peugeots. So yeah, there's lots of
yeah,
shared parts, wasn't there?
it was not great. I mean, that thing drank oil like nobody's business. And yeah, we had a lot of problems with it. It wasn't like absolutely calamitous, but it wasn't great. It was quite fun to drive. It was fun at like I was like 24, 25 years old at the time, so it was fun. But that was probably the worst. But I haven't had any. I have touched wood so far. I haven't had any major clangers. Um,
Wow.
so we we talked about post peak. One thing that I'd be interested to get your opinion on, and maybe we pick one brand for this week and cover it again in a future one as a common topic. But and I think post peak is slightly different for in different brands. Knowing that we've both owned and driven and liked BMWs before, what's your view on when peak BMW was?
I would say, and everyone's going to say it's very cliche, but I'd say the E46 was probably post, and I've only driven one once, and I've got a friend of mine that won't let me drive his, so I definitely want to have another go in it. But I would say that's probably post in terms of a motive. But then I recently have owned and recently sold an E92 M3 competition,
Yeah,
and with so that's the big V8, and I think that for me that age I wouldn't say it's just E92. I would just say that that age for me was post peak BMW, and the reason why I say that is because I think it came with more power, more scare. So it felt like the E92 particularly was quite a snappy car.
yeah,
Definitely lost the back end a couple of times in that car, especially in damper or colder conditions when the tires weren't particularly warm, despite having some really good electronics in that car. um, then we talk about maybe the 1M, which was obviously a Frankenstein car that was put together by a bunch of people in the M division with various different parts. And I kind of feel like the rationale behind that was just the stage that engines and the engineering level was at, complemented by, I guess, hydraulic steering. So
yeah,
the feedback from that car, you go into like maybe next generation of BMW, in my opinion, and it became a little bit more electronics. You had electronic steering, electronic damping, and still think they're great cars. But I would say for me, where I would probably sit is probably yeah E92. I think now, come to think about it, I'd say you've got the power, the reliability, but then you've got
definitely the
the
noise.
yeah, the noise for sure. And that's why I bought it, right? So part of our extended group, we've got a friend of mine that we do driving, early driving tours, early morning sort of tours, really, because we can't spend a whole weekend driving across the country yet. So we'd meet up early at 5 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning and go for a fairly brisk drive together in a group, before things got busy. And I remember being in the 911T following him in this E92. And, I would say from a performance standpoint, they were fairly evenly matched. I think you'd probably argue that you could get a lot more out of the 911T because it was a lot newer and a lot lighter perhaps, but actually the sound, especially when we used to drive through, Cheddar Gorge, and you can imagine just driving behind that through certain roads where the sound would just reverberate off of like the sound of the buildings and the cliffs and the tunnels that we were in. And it was just the sound that sold that car to me. The second I'd done a trip with him and drove behind him purposely for a few hours, we parked up and I said, look, if you ever get rid of that car, I'm doesn't matter how much you want, I'm buying it off you. I want that car. And
And you
the
did.
other, and I did, and the rationale behind that was also, I thought, well, he's having equally as much fun as I am in my 911, but from a cost perspective, that was probably at least two-thirds of the value, if not more. But he was having equally the same amount of fun. So I was like, hang on a sec, there must be a market here, or I'm interested in finding something. Where is that kind of sweet spot where you can get 80-90% of the fun, but maybe 30% of the cost? Like
Yeah,
that's what I'm really.
interestingly, the only reflection that I would have on that is I remember you and I went out for one of those early summer morning drives, and at the time I had an F82 M4 and you were in your M3, and we went up a twisty, awesome A road. And I remember you saying afterwards that you were just feeling there that's where the performance difference between the two cars was. That I was just able to push that little bit more than you were on that particular day and on that particular road. But I think as long as you're, for me, as long as you're on the edge of the performance of the car, whether you're doing 60 miles an hour, whether you're doing 55 miles an hour, or whether you're doing a lot more than that if you're on somewhere else, um, I don't think you're going to be having loads more fun doing 80 miles an hour than you are doing 60 miles an
No.
hour. If you're on the edge of grip and on the edge of the performance of the car, then that's
Yeah,
where you
and
want to be with
and
a
I
load.
and I personally think the sweet spot of performance, if you take performance numbers, because you can get 1,000 horsepower electric vehicles now. You can go into a showroom and someone will buy you, sell you a 1,000 horsepower electric car, which is like basically giving someone like a machine gun and saying off you go, without any driving experience. So they can be
Mm,
lethal, right? Because they're so fast. But then
yeah.
equally, that probably comes with a huge amount of safety and maybe not a lot of emotion. I think the sweet spot in terms of performance and power is probably about 400 horsepower. Is probably an accessible amount of performance. You can have a lot of fun in that
In an average
banding.
weighted car, I guess you mean,
In an
right?
average, yeah, in an average
Like
weight, yeah. When
1,500 kilos, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
when we're not talking 2.5, 3 tons of electric vehicle, we're talking
Yeah.
more like 1,500 to 1,800 of a modern classic kind of vehicle. But I would
Yeah.
say that sort of performance for most road environments means that you can kind of stretch its legs without feeling like you're going to lose your license or kill yourself.
Yeah.
you know, and that's
Yeah.
for me where I'm very interested in that part of the market from a cost standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint too, to try and
Yeah.
find out where that sweet spot is from a balance perspective. What about you? Where would you say, if we take BMW as a brand, where would you say that kind of peak was?
Very similar. I've been trying to think of a different angle, but for me, I loved the era where the main three German manufacturers were just stuffing absolutely massive engines in cars because at the time that was the way that they were going about getting maximum performance. So there's two cars that stick out. One is the E90 M3, and I love the E9. I love the E92 as well, but the E90, I love the fact it's got the coupe front end. But then the four door body. I nearly bought one a couple of years ago, but it was one of those that looked great on paper in the pictures, and then when you went and seen it in person, and you've seen the person who's trying to sell it, you're like, no, I'm fine, thank you. So that car, and also as I mentioned before, I had an E91 touring for like 5 years. That was tuned by Birds in Ivor, who are like a renowned local tuner. It had Bilstein suspension on it, remap, limited slip diff, and it was a wagon that I took my first baby home from hospital in. And I think that car, I you were talking about it earlier. I think I only lost 1,500 quid on it, and it was absolutely rock solid. I had one or two sensor issues and a DPF light that came on once, and that was about it. So I've got strong, strong love for that era of BMW. But the other one that for me is increasingly peak is the the M5 from that era, the V10 M5, which again at the time, like I thought the styling cues on that, the Chris Bangle era styling cues on that car were rubbish, and I hated it. And I was like, why are these door lines so high? Why is the glass so small? Like it just looks rubbish. I think that car is was so ahead of its time. An E60 um, is just, I think it looks so good now. You could launch that car today, and I don't think it would particularly look out of place, particularly on the exterior. On the interior, obviously, things have moved on, and the original
What you
iDrive that was in that car was rubbish. But I love that V10 soundtrack.
what you're
Uh,
saying about the look of that, how you felt emotionally about that car back then is exactly the way I feel about the new M5 right now. I'm sure it's an absolute piece of kit. I'm sure it's a weapon. I'm sure that it's the ideal Swiss Army knife if you're looking for a very large vehicle. But I've got exactly the same emotional attachment to looking. When I walk up to it, I was parked next to one in the car park the other day, and I just thought it's a unit. It was part. It was,
yeah,
I had a hatchback. Then there was that, and then there was a Range Rover, and actually the footprint of it was the same size as the Range Rover, and the width of it was, I think, roughly the same size. And I'm thinking that car is huge,
yeah, it
just
looks like
about.
a big melted blob that then has an
Yeah,
absolutely hideous, massive rear diffuser on the back of it that just doesn't suit the car. Yeah,
I don't. Maybe we're getting old, but I think the styling is. I look at, say, like you said, the E92 shape, and I just think that's classic. That's timeless in some ways, and I think the M5 is definitely growing of me of that era as well. But when I look at the latest M3s and the M5s, the latest generation of those, I'm just not in love with them. I don't walk up to them thinking I really think this is a pretty car. I walk up to it thinking that's a big car, that looks heavy, and you then see the some of the work that's been done on some of those cars, and you just think they just look absolutely horrific,
I look at it
hideous,
and I
and
just see depreciation first.
well, that's this the scary point as well.
Yeah,
The amount that they're costing to run, and the cost of owning one of those is quite scary. So I think that's
yeah,
pushing us more into peak, because you kind of look at value for money as well, which is really important these days, right? You think
mm,
owning an E92. I mean, the one that I had, and I talk about borrowing cars because I look after them. Apart from that Land Rover, which was obviously a £2,000 purchase off eBay, every other vehicle that I've owned in between and since then, I feel like I've got a responsibility of care, that you kind of feel like you're looking after it for the person that's going to buy it off you, and I think ownership of these type of vehicles is mega important. And I think even more so as they become older, as the peak moves back slightly, as newer cars are created and the timeline moves, I think people like us are going to want a history. We want to understand the types of people that have owned these cars, the condition these cars have been kept in. I think there's a lot to. So the reason why I bought that M3, as an example, was because I think there was a history of at least a decade of
yeah,
ownership prior to me buying it, which gave me the confidence that it had been well looked after, it had had a good life, and I think that's so important when we talk about peak ownership and that era of car.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that's probably a good place to end. We're going to try and keep these episodes around half an hour so that people can consume them without it taking up too much of their day. So hopefully that's given you a good flavor of what this podcast is about. We're going to try and come up with lots of interesting topics and hopefully bring on some really interesting guest speakers as well. So if you've enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments and like and subscribe to the channel. And hopefully you'll get much more interesting content from us in the coming weeks and months. Thanks very much. See you soon.